My name is Dr. Yosef Kaplowitz. I have the privilege and honor to introduce Rabbi Mordechai Willig, Rosh Yeshiva of Yeshiva Rabbi Yitzchak Elchanan, Reeds-based Medrash of Yeshiva University, to discuss the topic of balancing best medical and halachic practice. This year was put together by the Orthodox WhatsApp chat and the Jewish Physicians Network. Orthodox is a group of 370 practicing frum physicians in all fields of medicine. Our mission is to create a community of frum physicians to network, share cases, and discuss current medical issues. Our group is restricted to graduated physicians. I will be on the lookout when there are interesting topics in medicine and halacha that come up and try to get experts in both of those fields to discuss those topics with our group. To join Orthodox, please reach out to one of our administrators, Dr. Shana Hirsch, 917-275-6188, Dr. Sroli Ziskin, 917-741-0400, Dr. Yitzchak Reich, 917-587-6634, Dr. Shimshi Zimmerman, 917-886-5668, and Dr. Mary Lieberman, 917-589-8305. The Jewish Physicians Network, or JPN, is a nonprofit that fosters community for the Jewish medical trainees and for physicians to excel in all career stages while offering support and alignment with members' religious values. The JPN provides a variety of offerings, including a virtual community of over 450 residents, medical students, and physicians, live networking socials, and an up-to-date Shabbos accommodating residency database, Ask the Rabbi portal for guidance from leading rabbinic authorities, and CME accredited medical ethics and grand rounds. Without further ado, here's Rabbi Mordechai Willig.
Okay, let us begin. I was asked to discuss a particular topic this evening, which, although it sounds very fancy, shemancy, Delancey, about the interface of medicine and halacha, what it really means in plain Mama Loshen is as follows. A physician is asked to provide a service, and this service, the physician is fully aware, is going to be used by the recipient of this service for a purpose which is halachically prohibited. There are numerous examples of this. The issue is, you are facilitating a Jewish person committing a sin, an avera. That is called, in our parlance, misayeya lidei ovre avera. Someone who is helping, facilitating another individual to commit a sinful act, which is something which we try very hard to avoid. Physicians, on the other hand, are regularly put into a position where they are challenged with these type of situations. Give an example someone gave me. A person serving as an anesthesiologist. Okay, that sounds innocent enough. What happens if the particular surgery that's going to be transpiring as a result of the anesthesia is halachically problematic or prohibited? We can talk about abortions. We can talk about other types of, surgeries that are problematic to say the least. The latest one being these gender-altering surgeries, things of this nature. There can be very serious problems, but you're not the surgeon. If you're the surgeon, so then you have a problem much worse than misayeya. You yourself might be a violation of a particular prohibition. But if you're only the anesthesiologist, all you're doing is putting someone to sleep. That's all. Someone else is performing the surgery which may be halachically problematic or prohibited. So what have you done? All you've done is facilitate this surgery to take place after you complete your process of anesthesia. That's a good example of what we're discussing here this evening. You are misayeya. Misayeya de ovre avera. You're helping the next physician, you're helping the patient to participate in sinful activity. What does that mean for you as a physician? So this, of course, transcends medicine. It applies to all areas of Jewish law. What do you do if someone asks you to do something which facilitates sinful activity on his or her part? So the locus classicus is a Gemara Masechta Avodah Zarah, talks about somebody who wants to consume food which is prohibited to that individual. And the Gemara distinguishes between two cases. One side of the river and two sides of the river. if the person and the food are on two different sides of the river, and there's no way that the individual can get to this food without you throwing it over the river, that's called lifnei iver lo sitein michshol, a much more serious sin, one which is we're all familiar with, Pasuk in Parshas Kedoshim. You are placing a stumbling block in front of the blind. This fellow is not blind physically, he's blind spiritually. That's a very serious Torah obligation, which the Gemara says explicitly applies, even if the ultimate sinner is not even Jewish. The case in the Gemara is you're going to throw what's called Aver Min HaChai, which you know is one of the 7 basic commandments, even B'nai Noach. You throw it across the river to a non-Jew. That's a Torah violation of Lifnei Iver Lo Sitein Michshol. It must be avoided at all costs. What happens, though, if the person and the offender are on the same side of the river, Chadev or Denara, and that individual has the opportunity to get the non-kosher food by himself or herself? It involves walking over, taking a walk for a few seconds to the 100 yards away and picking up the non-kosher food and bringing it back to where you're sitting at your table. He said, you know what? Chaim, throw me over that piece of non-kosher meat. Let's say it's an Avim and Achai. So John asks Chaim, throw me over that non-kosher meat, that Avim and Achai. There's no lifnei iver. He could have gotten it by himself very easily, just walking over those few feet. He's too lazy. He wants you to throw it over. May you do so. Here's another problem. Not lifnei iver. It's misayeya l'dei ovrei avera. You're helping others commit sinful activity. But what is the nature of that prohibition? Where does it say in the Torah? Where does it say? Lifnei iver, we know. That's only Trei Iver Denara, 2 sides of the river. Same side. Where does the Torah tell us it's prohibited? Well, it never says so explicitly. The assumption is as follows. We know we have a concept of responsibility for one another called aravus. We have a responsibility called tochacha. Hocheach tochiach es amisecha. We're supposed to see to it that our amisim, that our colleagues don't do something sinful. So if you have to bear responsibility for him and you have to chastise him to avoid sinful behavior, how much more so may you not facilitate the Avera? By facilitating the Avera, you're in violation of the principle of Arvus, responsibility, or specifically, Hocheach tochiach es amisecha. You shall surely chastise your colleague, your amis, and by giving him the non-kosher food, that's a violation. However, in contradistinction to lifnei iver, it does not apply to non-Jews. Hocheach tochiach es amisecha does not apply to non-Jews. 2 sides of the river, lifnei iver, can be a non-Jew, can also be an iver. Yitzevim anachai, blindly. But misayeya, which is only based on hochiach tochiach es amisecha, does not apply to a non-Jew. So you're permitted to throw the Evim and Achai to John, who's on the same side of the river as you, too lazy to get up and get it from you 50 feet away. Okay. Now, the question becomes, can we utilize this dispensation found in the Gemara and the Mefarshim right there in Avodah Zarah, the Avav, about Chadiv Denar with respect to a non-Jew? Can we extend it beyond a non-Jew? So if one looks in the Shach in Riverdale, in Siman Kuf Nun Aleph, one gets an impression that the answer to that question is yes. Because there could be somebody who is Jewish, halachically, but is still not in the category of Amisecha. How can that be? He's Jewish. His mother's Jewish. How can that be? So to give you a source which you can find more readily, I refer you to the Bir Halacha of the Mishnah Berurah in Hilchos Erev Yom Kippur, where the following is stated. There is a concept of making sure that someone doesn't sin. That's called Hocheach Tochichas Amisecha. Says the Chafetz Chaim in Bir Halacha, quoting from Tana D'Velio Rabbah, that only applies to, in his words, Amisecha b'Torah u'v'mitzvos, which means he is your colleague in fulfilling Torah and mitzvos. Right now, in a momentary lapse, he's going to do something sinful, whether purposely or accidentally, you're required to stop him. But someone, explains the Bir Halacha, who's completely outside this category of Amisecha b'Torah v'mitzvos, is not keeping any of the mitzvahs, doesn't keep Shabbos, doesn't keep kashrus, he's no longer Amisecha b'Torah v'mitzvos. As a result, the Hocheach Tochiach requirement does not apply. And by extension, the violation of Messiah, the over Avera, does also not apply. So says the Shach in Yeridea, Simon Kuf Nun Aleph, with respect to whom he calls a Yisrael Mumar, someone who's gone to another religion. But by the operative phrase of Amisecha, the Torah of the mitzvahs, he need not have gone on to another religion. He's simply not observing Torah mitzvahs. Doesn't keep Shabbos. That's a simple example of what this entails. So now, back to our question. If someone is asked to be a Messiah, the example before of an anesthesiologist, so that the surgery can be done, which is against halacha, it depends. If the practitioner and the patient are both not Jewish, there is no Messiah, that's clear, and therefore the anesthesiologist can do what he does and does not worry about facilitating sinful behavior by a non-Jewish doctor or non-Jewish patient. What if one of them is Jewish but totally non-observant? Sadly, the significant majority of Jews in America are non-Sabbath observant. You'll say, for most of them, it's not their fault. The Tinach Shenishba, they don't know any better, they weren't brought up any better. That may be true, but de facto, he's not a Shomer Torah or Mitzvos. The fact is that Tinach Shenishba prevents us from doing things because of his particular status, which might be hurtful to him. But on the other hand, can you say he's Amisecha b'Torah v'mitzvahs? He's a colleague in keeping the Torah? No. Is it his fault? No. Does he keep Torah mitzvahs? No. He's not Amisecha. This is the reason, my dear friends, that we assume that non-Orthodox Jews are not kosher for testimony. They're posel yedus. This is something which has prevented the conception of thousands upon thousands of potentially illegitimate children. There's so many individuals who get married and split up without a Jewish get, a kosher get, and then they have a child from a second marriage. That's a very serious problem. Rabbi Moshe Feinstein waved his magic wand many years ago and said, no, the first marriage is no good. Why not? Because there were no kosher witnesses. Why not? There were many Jews there. Yeah, but they weren't Shomer Shabbos. But it wasn't their fault. Tino Shanishba. Doesn't matter, said Rabbi Moshe. Bottom line, they're not keeping Torah mitzvahs. The conservative movement took great umbrage with that tshuva. They don't realize what a blessing it is for them. But not for that tshuva, there'd be a schism. You couldn't marry somebody from a conservative background because you have to be afraid it was a Jewish marriage and then not a Jewish get, and it'll be a disaster. The best way out is that there never was a Jewish marriage because there were no observant people in attendance. We do that all the time in our Beth Din. We check the guest list. Was anyone who's observant, who's not a very close relative? And that's how we're able to solve certain cases, post facto, of course. Anyway, given that, if the patient and physician are either not Jewish or even if they're Jewish but not observant Jews, they don't keep Shabbos, we can assume there's no Easter of Messiah they over Avera. And therefore the anesthesiologist can go about his or her business to provide the anesthesia, even though it's going to result in sinful behavior on the part of either the physician, the patient, or both. The reason again being, they could have done it without you. They get a different anesthesiologist, Jewish, not Jewish. They get somebody else. You're not the only anesthesiologist in the whole world. They could do without you. It's like one side of the river. And therefore, there's room for leniency in that kind of a case. This is my fundamental presentation of the issue. I know that the people who asked me to talk want to leave ample time for questions. So I'm going to pause here for a moment, see if there are any questions. If not, we can continue in a somewhat different vein. Please feel free to ask a question. Don't hesitate. There's not meant to be a monologue.
Okay. Is my question going through?
I don't hear any question.
The question is that often people will say, but you're going to be making a chilul Hashem. How does the Rosh Yeshiva address that answer? That taina?
That's a very significant question. But chilul Hashem is, in our circumstance, we might call it even a meta halachic category. What is the chilul Hashem? There were those who will say that by doing the anesthesia, it's a chilul Hashem. And there are those who will counter that by not doing the anesthesia, it's a chilul Hashem. I can hear claims in both directions. But these claims are both spurious. Because a chilul Hashem is when someone does not follow the halacha. And when it's discovered by the outside world, and they're critical of his failure to follow the halacha, that's called a chilul Hashem. However, if a person follows halacha, it's not a chilul Hashem, it's a kiddush Hashem. Now, it is true, as the questioner raised, sometimes the halacha will take into account the ramifications globally of a person's decision to do or not to do something in particular. Sometimes, depends on the circumstance, depends perhaps on the rabbi, depends on the doctor, depends on the patient. So many different considerations. But to state that the fact that an Orthodox anesthesiologist is performing anesthesia and someone is going to use that anesthesia for an abortion or whatever else is prohibited by the halacha, and says, what would you do? You did a chilul Hashem. What's the chilul Hashem? Well, you helped facilitate an abortion. I said, listen, I'm not a fan of abortions. If up to me, I wouldn't be doing anything about abortions. But I have a position in the hospital. I'm the anesthesiologist of record for this particular time slot. It's part of my occupation. Had it been prohibited for me to do it, I'd have to lie down and play dead and say I can't do it, no matter what the career implications might be. However, Rabbi X, Y, or Z, again, if other rabbis happen to agree with me, feel that technically speaking, it's not a violation at all, for reasons I just explained. So on the contrary, if it's not a halachik violation, and I'm just hiding behind my own personal sensibilities, as good as they may be, as valid as they may be, as much as I would agree with them myself, that could lead to a chilul Hashem on the other side. Who is this doctor? Holier than thou. I checked with my rabbi said, yeah, I have a rabbi, they'll check with the biggest rabbi, the new biggest rabbi, called AI, Hagarav Hagon AI. And they'll go on Harav Hagon AI. What if AI spills the beans to what I just said? There's no Messiah with respect to a non-Jew. So you know from AI that this Jewish doctor really could have done the anesthesia, but refused to do it on principle. When the Jewish law permitted it, that can also become a chilul Hashem in the other direction. So therefore, chilul Hashem is a two-edged sword. They say sometimes in America, you're damned if you do and damned if you don't. That is true. And you have to be very careful. And I'm not giving specific advice to any particular physician in a particular case. But bigadol, macro, in general, the first question is it halachically permissible or is halachically prohibited? It's prohibited, there's nowhere to go. If it's permissible, as I've just tried to argue, you might still want to get out of it. Maybe you can give it off to a colleague. I'm not opposed to that. But if push comes to shove and you're called upon, your job depends upon it, or your good graces in the department depend upon it, so many things can depend upon it, and you do the anesthesia, and someone comes to you and says, Echil Hashem, you say, listen, I don't know how you can know it's Echil Hashem. It's halachically permitted because of no mistake by non-Jews. I don't see why it's Echil Hashem. I'm not saying that I'm in favor of abortion. I'm just doing the prelim. I'm doing the anesthesia. And another doctor is doing the abortion. I'm not saying he's doing the right thing. That's a poor argument which makes sense to me. I'm sure there'll be those who will reject it, but any argument we make in life is rejected. But if you're convinced of the correctness of your position, so we're not necessarily going to be a Chil Hashem. Again, I'm not giving a particular psak for any particular case. I'm talking in more global and general terms. Any more questions, please?
I have a question about Trever Dinara and Messiah. Is it a davar pashut that when you can't do it yourself and someone else who's another mumcha you'd have to enlist to do it is considered Messiah, not Trever Dinara? In other words, the surgeon can't do the anesthesia.
Yeah. This is
and he'd have to find another.
Talmud Chacham is speaking. He's a alumnus of Morosh HaKol, where I find myself right now. It's always dangerous to teach Talmidim like that. They have come up with these great questions. You're probably either referring knowingly or unknowingly to the Mishnah Lamelech. The Mishnah Lamelech says exactly what you just said. Namely, that Charev Dinar, he can come get it himself. But what will happen if he can't get it himself? But if I don't help him, someone else can help him. Someone else can help him. Is there a problem? Is there not a problem? So the Mishnah Lamelech says, yes, it's still a problem. The example given is related to us, teaching Torah to non-Jews. So the Tosfos and Chagiga talks about it. Well, if I won't do it, someone else will do it. There's the Mishnah Melech, but then someone else is also going to be in violation. That's not considered to be Chariv Dinara. That is true, Dr. Roth. However, that's a case of teaching Torah where only Jews are qualified. We are discussing anesthesia, and as much as we'd like to think, the late Rabbi Tendler once said he's waiting for a time when all the patients will be Jews and all the doctors will be Jews and all the patients will be non-Jews. That's his utopian scheme. But we know it's not true. There are many, many qualified non-Jewish anesthesiologists. Not even a shaila. Now, therefore, if it can be done by someone else who's not of the Jewish persuasion, then I believe even the Mishnah Melech would agree that there's no lifnei iver. There are those who argue with the Mishnah Melech, even in his case. But in our case, well, the other person who could do it would not be Jewish, and he would be not in any violation. Then, on a simple level, there is a dispensation. Now, one can argue back and forth in the case of abortions. Since abortions, we believe that abortions are prohibited not only for Jews, for non-Jews alike. As a matter of fact, according to some authorities, according to all authorities, abortion is a capital offense for non-Jews as opposed to with Jews. It's an even more serious offense. The 2 days in Tosin Sanhedrin. This is very relevant. What about, we're all discussing the new laws and the Supreme Court decisions, etc., etc. We believe that abortion is not only permitted, but is mandated to save the life of the mother. The Pope in Rome, I'm not sure if I'm still current, but for many centuries, disagreed that abortion is prohibited, even to save the life of the mother. Is he right? Is he wrong? Well, forgive me for this funny expression. It's 2 days in Tosin Sanhedrin, believe it or not. Whether it's permissible for a non-Jew to perform an abortion to save the life of the mother. Two opinions. So, if one accepts a stricter opinion, then you have a bit of a problem, even in that kind of a case, because maybe, even though there's a non-Jewish anesthesiologist, well, it might still be a problem. The solution to that problem is, even if it's prohibited for a non-Jewish anesthesiologist, practitioner to perform an abortion, it may even be a capital offense for that individual. Nonetheless, presumably, there's no Easter of lifnei iver when it comes to non-Jews. And therefore, the Mishnah Melech's prohibition, which emanates from teaching Torah to Goyim, which presumably only a Jew could do, the Goyim did no Torah, would not extend to anesthesiologists, because another anesthesiologist can do it without Varlei Lifnei because he's not Jewish, and therefore the Jewish practitioner can do it as well. That's a partial answer to Dr. Ross' very learned question. Okay, more questions.
If it's a from physician being proposed, basically having a proposal to us to ask if it's a single male, who the question is, how observant is this male? With that's I guess part of the shaila, but he would want, let's say, Viagra to and he's not married, so obviously we're assuming he's going to be using this for an avera, that he's going to be having a meisus nos, and therefore are we assisting in that meisus nos by giving him such a prescription? Or even a simpler question, if you're going to be prescribing even birth control, let's say, unfortunately, this happens sometimes that, women forget it. And even if you're not, let's say, the practitioner involved, they need to have it for normal function, but you have no idea if they actually have a heter or not. So, I know you don't necessarily have to ask, and therefore that's more of their shaila, but the question is, let's say if they don't have a heter, are you allowed to then still give them the birth control anyway?
Okay. Those two cases are not identical. I think you fully appreciate
that. No, I know.
The birth control, I have no problem dispensing birth control. No problem. We have no right to assume that the person using birth control is going to use it in an illicit fashion. I don't think you're allowed to ask in some cases whether the person is married or not. So the person could be married, has a perfect head to use birth control to space between children, etc., as many, many, many totally orthodox Jewish women are doing with the psak of a reliable rabbi. So that's that situation. If you know that the patient is not married, then the birth control is not much different than the Viagra shaila, because they're going to be people who will be involved in relations without the benefit of marriage, and by giving him Viagra, you're enabling him to do it physically, and by giving her birth control, you're enabling her to do it, forgive the expression today, safely, so not to conceive a baby. So those are somewhat similar questions. And I give you the same answer I gave before. If someone is a quote Shomer Torah mitzvahs, but they have, we used to call them in the old days 612ers. 612ers. They keep all the mitzvahs except when it comes to men, women stuff. They're given to their hormones and they commit sinful activity. That can come to all different levels of what kind of illicit activity. And I'm not here to discuss the other more, how should we say it, questionable practices. We all know that relations outside of the context of marriage are prohibited, period, no matter how you slice it. Not allowed. So by giving Viagra or birth control to an unmarried person, of the male and female respectively, you are enabling them to do something which they would presumably not be able to do. In the first case, physically unable to have relations without the Viagra. And the second case, although physically it could be done, but presumably it wouldn't be done for fear of conception. Okay, fine. I would go back to my same paradigm. Lifnei Iver, it certainly isn't. You can get Viagra any way you want. You can get birth control wherever you want. Come on, everyone knows that. But there's a Messiah problem. But once again, who is the patient? If the patient is a Shomer Torah mitzvahs of 612 of them, and is only in violation of illicit relations, I would not prescribe that Viagra. I would not prescribe that birth control pill, because you're Messiah, the over Avera, of someone who is fundamentally Amisecha B'Torah mitzvahs. They just can't control their Yetzer for one particular thing. On the other hand, if the patient doesn't keep Shabbos, just to give the most prominent example, so then he's not Amisecha B'Torah mitzvahs. There's no lifnei iver. There's no hochech lechichas amisecha. Then I would prescribe it. I draw the exact same lines as I did before with respect to much more serious issues here as well.
Well, my other question is, sometimes we have it for women who, let's say, are going, let's say teenage, because I'm a pediatrician, so sometimes we have teenage girls who are going to be promiscuous. And again, if they're a 612er, the question is, there's still the more of the issue of creating mamzerim. So my question is, do we balance that in any way, or is it still Masei L'Divei Avera and it's still, that's the story?
Okay, and the no mamzer be created by premarital sex. There's no mamzer. It's a very deplorable. It's horrible. It's terrible. It's no mamzer. Mamzer is only if a married woman engages in relations with a Jewish man, produces a child. That's a mamzer. But if a single woman, I'm sorry.
No, please. I'm sorry.
Go ahead. Go finish.
No, I just wanted to ask a question that if you can add at Tzad Heter that even though it's a from person, there is a minority indication to use Viagra for, let's say, Raynaud's phenomenon or pulmonary hypertension or regulating cycles with birth control pills in rare situations. It's definitely not the majority indication. Is the doctor mechuyev to ask the indication, or can you rely on that tzad rechayka that maybe they're using it for permissible cause?
I don't understand you, doctor. I have to assume if I got someone doctor's office says, "Doctor, I need Viagra," then any responsible doctor would say, "My dear friend, why?" He'll say, "Doctor, come on, you know why? I have a girlfriend."
Right.
Or he'll say, "I had this case. Dr. Glatt was asked this question and he consulted with me about it, but someone who was completely halachic, 100%. But the question was, for some, you use a medical term which I didn't recognize. There was something wrong with him, and he had to have erections or ejaculation on a regular basis to prevent some bacterial buildup. The details I don't remember anymore. And he had to ejaculate regularly. And the question then was, his wife is trying to be understanding, but there's a limit. It's an older woman, older man. And the question was with respect to masturbation. That was that particular question. So I know there's a rare case where the person is going to have to do something which is illicit based on Viagra. But those are rare cases. If less than 1%, I have to imagine. So you have to assume, unless the patient tells you, well, of course, the patient could be lying to you. That's his responsibility. If he doesn't lie to you and doesn't say, he says, doctor, why I need this? So then I go back to my paradigm from before.
Yeah, another question I think that I know that came up, I think, was about assisting euthanasia. I mean, there are touched on it a little bit, but let's say pulling the plug, and you're the critical care doctor, or you're the PICU attending, or the NICU attending, and the patient's not doing well, and you're on service that week for whatever it is. I mean, are you allowed to go and pull the plug, whether it's a yid or a guy? Because again, it's Masayel Devar Avera. If there is no, let's say, if again, we had a whole topic discussion of what is considered death, whether it's the heart versus the brain, but depending upon whichever way you're going to look at, you're assuming the patient's not going to make it or whatever it is. Are you allowed to pull the plug if the family is requesting, so to speak? There
are two questions.
Correct.
One is the way you phrase it, which I think is not precise. Namely, can you pull the plug? You as a physician. My doctors tell me they don't pull plugs. The nurses pull the plugs. So the question is going to be whether you can give the instructions to pull the plug.
Right.
I think that's a more accurate presentation of the question. Because if you're doing it, it's not a question of Masayel Ifnei, it's a question of Ritzicha, literally. If you're not doing it, someone else is doing it. So what happens then? So here we go to a very complex analysis. Let's say, for example, you alluded to before, the patient is brain dead. As you alluded to, the controversy among Jewish rabbinic figures and halachic figures is brain dead or not dead. We all know what the chief rabbin had to say about it, the late Rabbi Tenda, what he had to say about it, the late Rabbi Rabinovich, what he had to say about it. We all know the landscape. I think it's fair to say, speaking now in 2023, what should I say? I'm just starting to think back how far. Let's say approximately 30 years after the more than that, closer to 40 years after the major brouhaha, 30-something years that erupted among the great rabbis, both in the States and in Eretz Yisrael at the time. It's just a little more than 30 years ago. So the different opinions. We know the different opinions. Is there lifnei iver, if I personally hold from a stricter opinion, and then you accept the more lenient opinion? and I assist you in doing what I think is not allowed. That's a major discussion, which has great ramifications. Take a trivial case. Here we're talking about potential murder. Give me a trivial case. I don't accept the Eruv, and I want to get something from across the street, but you do accept the Eruv. I say, hey, do me a favor, can you carry this safer across the street? Is that lifnei iver? A whole discussion about that. He's following a reliable rabbi who built an Eruv. You have your own chumras, whatever. Same thing applies over here. I mean, it's very likely that the percentage of rabbis pro and con are different, but in principle, he also death. You don't know from brain death. There may not be any lifnei iver at all in that case, since there are very, very famous rabbis, Talmidei Chachamim, who accepted brain death. You may not accept it for yourself, but if he's going to accept it, so then there may not be lifnei iver at all in that kind of a case. So you have to be careful about every single particular case. Is it a certain violation? Is it a potential violation? Is it a disputed violation? All these things exist, and you have to tackle each one individually.
Let's say it's a situation where it's clearly not brain death, not heart death. I mean, the patient's, breathing on their own, but unfortunately in the hospital situation today, they'll often pull the plug and end life prematurely. They'll turn down the oxygen and take off all these other things that are keeping the patient alive, and they'll die, and they'll basically cause that. And you're uncomfortable doing it, obviously, or writing the order. So it's definitely, you're uncomfortable. Would it be, so if you say you're masalik yourself, you say, I am uncomfortable, I'm stepping away, that would be, I would assume that would be fine. What about if you say, well, I don't do that, but Dr. So-and-so, you could go to him, he'll be able to take care of you. Is that called Messiah by designating a different doctor who will take care of the patient in their wishes that are not in concert with Allah?
Okay. Number one, I have to tell you what you may not be aware of. There were some great rabbis who said that pulling the plug is not considered to be what we call withdrawing. It's called withholding. In the old days, when they had the oxygen tanks, so Moshe, the famous tshuva, says, listen, this guy says, just don't refill the tank. When the tank runs out, the person will die. That's okay. You didn't do anything. It just withheld. You didn't withdraw. It's been many years since they have oxygen tanks, but for quite a period of time, when they had these tubes in the mouth, they had to suction you out every once in a while. Every X number of hours, they'd pull it out, suction you, and put it back again. So there was a redoing of Rav Moshe's tshuva. When next time the nurse pulls it out to do suction, just don't put it back. The equivalent of not filling up the next tank. Today, if I understand correctly, correct me if I'm wrong, the progression of modern medicine, no longer a need to remove the tube to suction. It just happens somehow automatically. The tube is never removed. That being the case, this option doesn't exist. Nonetheless, there are authorities who say that even if you would remove a tank or would remove an air supply, you didn't take something away. You're just withholding the next spate of air, the next airflow to come in. That's a minority opinion. I will concede it's a minority opinion. But it's not a non-existent opinion even within, halachis of the first rank. So one can argue, listen, there is a halachis who suggests that that's a possibility, and therefore they're relying on that minority view, and therefore it's not a problem. I had a case like that once, a brain dead patient. It was a very sad case. A young woman attempted suicide. She was mentally not well, and she was 99% successful. She was brain dead. A young woman. And the parents were petrified she'd be this way for an endless amount of time. So I had an idea, which I implemented. There was some critique. And then I found out later, Baruch Hashem, that Dr. Steinberg quotes this idea from both Shlomo Zalman and Rabbi Vosner. Namely, you and I breathe, if I have it straight, air which is 21% oxygen. We breathe, I understand, 6 to 12 times a minute, something along those lines, the average person. If I'm correct, these ventilators give you 100% oxygen and 20 times a minute because the patient is compromised. I said to myself, okay, you don't want to pull the plug completely and stop the flow of oxygen. I don't understand that. Why is this patient entitled to more oxygen than any other person? So reduce the machine to 6 to 10 breaths of 21% oxygen. This, of course, you know medicine better than me, will shorten the life of the patient quite clearly. What did I do wrong? I'm not mechuyev to give the patient more than HaKadosh Baruch Hu gave him. 21% oxygen with 6 to 10 breaths a minute. That's all. That's printed in Rav Steinberg's Encyclopedia Chatut Refuit, name of these two giants. It resurfaced during COVID. Oh, a whole tumult. Dr. Steinberg wrote a whole book about COVID, and this thing resurfaced. Again, the same idea. And yes, you shouldn't do it very precipitously. Should gradually lower the oxygen levels. Okay. Whatever it may be, that's what I'd recommend in such circumstances. But again, every single case is somewhat different. It's very hard to go into the details of a case which hasn't happened yet. You have to, as you said, thank you in your kind remarks, we're talking about what you call Rosh Prokim, general rules. General rules are only as good as they are, but particular cases require each and every one, as they say in the Holy Land, kol mikre legufo. Every case according to its own particulars. That's important in this context as well.
Are there any further questions?
Yes, I have a question for the Rav. How does the Rav differentiate the idea that you just conveyed with respect to reducing the oxygen on a patient who's in bad shape to the general rule in triage that the patient who already is receiving care has a chazaka to continue having a right, even though another incoming patient would have a better prognosis if they would just switch out the other guy who's going to lose that other patient who's going to die in a certain amount of time anyhow. I don't see a consistency, but I'm sure there is that you could explain.
Well, don't be so sure, because consistency is often an enemy of the truth. Consistency sometimes requires us to do things which we would never want to do. But your point is very well taken, very, very well taken. It came up during COVID again. Rabbi Schechter, if you remember, wrote something about taking a ventilator, taking care of one patient and splitting it to use two patients. And there was concern that that might have some minimal negative impact on the patient who has a quote-unquote chazaka they're describing. And there were some rabbis, colleagues of Rabbi Schechter, who were very upset by that psak. He never retracted the psak. He felt, given the circumstances of COVID, it was appropriate. Because as I said before, consistency is not always a good thing when it comes to these triage and other types of situations. I will tell you, just to answer your question briefly, because it's a very, very good question. We're working with an assumption that there is a position in halacha that the patient is already dead, brain death. Now, if brain death is death, you're not, Rabbi Tendler would always say in his heyday, who can forget, Rabbi Tendler would say, he's on a machine, he's brain dead, call the Chevra Kadisha. Call the Chevra Kadisha, unplug him and bury him. Now, whether you agree or don't agree with Rabbi Tendler, he was a great rabbi. His position was confirmed by Rabbi Rabinovich from Malay Adumim later, from the chief rabbinate of Israel. So, very nice that you and I may not agree, and Rabbi Yoshim, Rabbi Shlomo Zalman, and others didn't agree. We didn't agree. But the fact that I don't agree with something doesn't mean that the other position has no validity whatsoever. So that's kind of a context I was describing in my previous presentation. Not inconsistent with something where there's no possibility that the patient is considered to be dead. There always are, nuances and what we call in our language of rabbinic literature, tzirufim, additional considerations that come to play when a Rav has to make a halakha decision. So I thank you for the great question. I gave you a partial answer.
Just to harp a little bit further.
Wow. Aren't you a lawyer, Moshe?
Yes.
I just wanted to make sure.
But I represent families that have after these kinds of questions.
Very good. I just want to make sure I know who I'm talking to. Very good. Keep up your good work.
Thank you.
Hi, Rabbi Willig. Menachem Jacobs here. A question that keeps coming up is regarding DNRs, DNIs. There are definitely cases where you don't necessarily have the ambiguity in the sniffim to use, so to speak, to allow for enough room to sign a DNR, DNI. But residents have to routinely sign these documents, and based on their pronouncements, patients will get the care that their systems require, regardless of the ramification. Would a resident, a first year or second year, be able to sign such a document?
Okay. Let me tell you a story. Many years ago, 2 Holocaust survivors were sitting in the back of the shul, and as I walked in at 8:30 in the morning, and one said to the other, Avrum, ich hab gechasst mit der DNR. I signed a DNR. These are people who were in fairly good health. They were elderly. I was so upset by this. I changed my drasha that Shabbos, and I gave like almost like a political kind of a stumping drasha. DNR, rip it up. Rip it up. Because DNR I found to mean at the time DNT. Do not treat. You gave up on your life? Why am I mechuyev to go to the end of the world for you? And therefore it went way beyond the DNR mandate. Way, way beyond. So I always say you rip it up. Having said that, there are cases which are extreme when DNR is perfectly appropriate. Perfectly appropriate. I still remember, I'll give you my personal case. My mother, Aleha Shalom, had the last days on this earth from the cancer which spread, and bottom line was that their lungs are filling up with water. And that's the end. There's nothing. It's just a matter of X number of hours. That's until you can't live anymore. The liver was gone. There's no way out. And the doctor came, a very heroic doctor. Remember, it was a night after Shavuos. The doctor was far away in the Poconos or the Catskills, and he came by in Queens, where he lived, and where my mother lived, and where I was that night. Told my father, I'm sorry to say, you should sign a DNR. Because if you don't sign a DNR, the lungs will be filling up with water, everything's going to shut down, and they're going to start pumping the chest and breaking your ribs for no purpose whatsoever. I said to my father, Abba, you have to sign a DNR. Ain Breyer, there's no choice at that late stage. Now, obviously, the case that the good resident was describing are more ambiguous. More ambiguous. In general, DNRs, I had a question today about a DNR. Just this evening, I'm not discussing ancient history. What was a question from one of the distinguished Rabbanim? A 90-year-old woman has 3 children. She has many failures, and she 2 kids wanted to start a DNR. 2 kids don't want to see a DNR, and one does. I said he's outvoted. So I asked if the patient lucid, and the answer was yes. So ask the patient. We believe in patient autonomy in many of these ambiguous cases. So the response was they asked the patient, and the patient said, yes, I want a DNR. But the 2-3 kids, nah, Ma's not lucid anymore. I told the rabbi, go see Ma herself. If you see her as lucid, and the decision of DNR is not irrational, based on the circumstances, then you listen to her. You listen to her. So DNRs, are very, very case specific. Can't fundamentally, I'm against it, only because of the DNT extension that hospitals typically utilize. In extreme cases, it's appropriate. In some cases, I tell the patient, sign a DNR, but don't give it in. hold it, because if they have it, they'll do DNT. If you hold it, and the time comes when it's appropriate, but the patient is no longer able to make his or her own decision, you produce it. Every case is somewhat different. So an attending or resident signing a DNR or authorizes a DNR, obviously is a case-by-case basis. As long as there's any position in halacha which would permit a DNR, the resident need not be holier than thou. Even if you yourself would not be comfortable with DNR in that circumstance. But there are other rabbis who are much more liberal with DNRs. And it's not the same as euthanasia. They're actively killing someone. DNR means you're just not taking heroic measures at a certain stage in the individual's illness. There's always a rabbi who, even a reliable rabbi, who will say DNR is appropriate in these kind of extreme circumstances. I know this thing called Chayam Aruchim, they're never in favor of DNR, but they go a little bit too far. They do wonderful work. They go a little bit too far, if you ask me. And therefore, you as an attending physician, I believe, if you think that the patient's or the family's decision is rational, not irrational, then I believe you're able to authorize a DNR, even if you yourself wouldn't do it for your own mother in that circumstance.
I don't think I'd be breaching any confidentiality by just noting that in specific appropriate cases, even the poskim, to my personal knowledge, at Chaim Aruchim will permit DNRs.
I'm happy to hear that.
Take the front page.
Okay, I'm happy to hear that because we need to have balance. Yeah. Okay, I think my time is up, Doctor. I thought it was supposed to be for 1 hour. I'm happy to go further, but I don't want to keep the audience captive.
Okay, thank you so much, Rabbi, for coming on. We really appreciate it. It was a great year, and looking for many things in the future together.
I'm happy to try to help you whenever I can. I wish everyone, first of all, it's exactly a week before Tisha B'Av, an easy fast, and I hope that you will continue to practice and make a Kiddush Hashem. I always tell my Talmidim, I have many Talmidim who are doctors. I would tell them as follows. The Gemara has a Masechta Tanis that Eliyahu Hanavi, the regards from Masifta Derakia to Rava once a year, Erev Yom Kippur, and to Abaye once a week on Erev Shabbos. And these blood letters, Abba Umna was a doctor. That's what it was in those days. Every day. How can it be? How can it be? Abaye and Rava are iconic figures who live on forever. Every day we learn their Torah. They only got regards from the heavenly academy once a week or once a year, and this anonymous Abba Umna, the doctor, every day. So the Gemara tells you why. Because he was a very caring and good doctor. He was very scrupulous in his activity. He was careful about his tznius when he had women patients. He was careful to honor any rabbinical patients of his. Wouldn't charge them. He'd give them money. What does that really mean? It means he made a tremendous Kiddush Hashem. Every Orthodox physician can make a tremendous Kiddush Hashem. Chalila the reverse. So I give you all a bracha, not just an easy fast, that's on a personal level for a week from today, but on a global level, for a long-range level, that each and every one of you will, as the Hippocratic oath, number one, above all, do no harm, and number two, will facilitate Kiddush Hashem when people will say, look at this physician. Wow, physician who observes Jewish law and is so caring and is so competent, so professional, so good, so nice, so kind. That's the ultimate Kiddush Hashem. That will help rebuild the Beis Hamikdash. B'mheira v'yameinu. Amen.
Amen.